My name is Celeste Marino. I'm 31 years old and I work from home helping small business owners stay on top of their emails and schedules. For the longest time, I thought I had it all figured out. I had a good husband, a cozy home, and a life that felt safe and peaceful. I honestly believed I was one of the lucky ones, but I was wrong. Looking back now, I can see that this story didn't start with heartbreak. It started with what felt like a dream. I met Rowan Calloway when I was 28. A friend invited us both to a small dinner, and that's where we met. Rowan wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't try to be the center of attention. He was calm, easy to talk to, and he actually listened when people spoke. We ended up talking for almost 3 hours about our families, our jobs, and the kind of life we both wanted. By the end of the night, he asked for my number, and I gave it to him without even thinking about it. We dated for 11 months, and those months were some of the happiest I've ever had. Rowan always remembered the little things about me. He knew exactly how I liked my tea, remembered that I loved quiet weekends, and never forgot that I always got cold at the movies. He'd bring me a jacket before I even asked. Those little things meant more to me than expensive gifts ever could. We got married on a Saturday in October. It wasn't a big wedding, just our close family and a few friends. It was simple, beautiful, and exactly what we wanted. As I stood there holding his hands, I remember thinking, I finally found my person. I finally have someone who's truly mine. The first few months of our marriage were wonderful. We lived in a small apartment that we rented. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like home because it was ours. We'd cook breakfast together on Sunday mornings, stay up late watching old movies, and laugh over the smallest things. Rowan worked as a project manager and I worked from home. We weren't rich, but we had enough and we were happy. His parents, Leonard and Meredith Calloway, lived about 40 minutes away. Leonard had retired after working as a school principal. He was quiet, kind, and almost always had a book in his hands. I liked him from the very beginning. Meredith was different. She was always nice to me. She smiled whenever she came over, brought homemade food, and asked how work was going. On the outside, everything seemed perfectly normal. But deep down, something never felt quite right. I couldn't explain it. It was just this strange feeling that she was always watching me, like she was quietly judging everything I did. I figured I was probably just overthinking it. Rowan loved his mom, and I didn't want to create problems over a feeling I couldn't even explain. So I smiled, made her tea whenever she visited, and pushed that feeling to the back of my mind. About 4 months after we got married, something happened that meant the world to me. One evening, my parents called. My dad said, "Celeste, your mom and I have been saving for a long time. We want to give you something. It's not a lot, but it's from the heart." A few minutes later, they sent me $10,000. I cried the moment I saw it in my account. My parents weren't wealthy. That money came from years of hard work and sacrifice. They went without things they wanted so they could help me someday. I'll never forget that. After I told Rowan about the money, he reached across the kitchen table, held my hands, and smiled. "Let's use it for something that really matters," he said. "Something that'll last." We'd already been talking about buying a house, and Rowan had money saved up too. When we added my $10,000 to his savings, we finally had enough for a down payment. For the next 6 weekends, we looked at houses. Every Saturday we'd drive around town, walk through empty rooms, and picture what our future could look like there. Then we found it. It was a small house on a quiet street with 2 bedrooms, a little backyard, and big windows that filled the place with warm morning light. The second I walked into the living room, I felt it. This is it, I thought. This is home. 3 weeks later, we signed the papers. I gave Rowan my $10,000 because he was handling all the paperwork. I didn't ask questions. I trusted him completely. He was my husband. I never had a reason not to. We moved in on a Friday. We carried boxes inside, laughed when the furniture got stuck in the doorway, and by that evening we were sitting on the living room floor eating pizza with boxes piled up all around us. Rowan smiled at me and said, "This is ours, Celeste. We built this together." I leaned my head on his shoulder and believed every single word. Life in our new house was really good. I turned the second bedroom into my little home office. Rowan left for work every morning around 8 and came home around 6. We had a simple routine, and honestly, I loved it. Meredith stopped by every now and then, and Leonard usually sat outside in the backyard reading one of his books. I always enjoyed talking with him. Meredith was different. Whenever she visited, she'd slowly walk through the house, looking at everything. She'd run her hand across the shelves, look at the walls, and take her time in every room. She always smiled and said nice things like, "It's beautiful, Celeste," or "You've made it feel so warm." But something about the way she said those words didn't sit right with me. It felt less like she was giving me a compliment and more like she was checking the place out. Still, I smiled, made her tea, and pushed that uneasy feeling aside. A year and 5 months after our wedding, everything changed. Leonard had a heart attack on a Tuesday morning and he passed away. Rowan was completely crushed. I'd never seen him cry before. That night he sat on the edge of our bed with his face in his hands and didn't move for a long time. I sat beside him, held him close, and stayed quiet because there really weren't any words that could make something like that better. Over the next few weeks, we helped Meredith with everything. We took care of the funeral, spent time with family, and tried to help her through those long, quiet days after everyone else had gone home. One evening, when the house was finally quiet again, Rowan looked at me and said, "She can't live by herself anymore. She's 64 and she's never lived alone." "I know," I said softly. He looked at me for a second before asking, "Would you be okay if she moved in with us?" I looked into his eyes and saw how heartbroken he still was. I knew how badly he wanted me to say yes. "Of course," I told him. "She's your mom, she's family." And I meant every word. Meredith moved in 3 weeks after the funeral. She brought 2 suitcases and a small box filled with Leonard's old books. She said she couldn't leave them behind. Rowan got the guest room ready for her and even hung a family picture on the wall next to her bed. That first night, I cooked her favorite dinner and set the table as nicely as I could. I wanted her to feel welcome. She sat down, looked slowly around the room, and then looked at me. "Thank you, Celeste," she said with a warm smile. "You're very kind." I smiled back. But there was something about the way she looked around that room. Slow, quiet, like she already knew every inch of the house. That strange feeling I'd buried so many times came back again. I told myself I was just being silly. I passed her the bread, poured her a glass of water, and tried to believe everything was going to be okay. I had no idea my whole life was about to change. The house that was never mine. Part 2A, when everything started to change. I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're sitting in your own home, in your kitchen, your living room, or your backyard. It's the house you helped pay for, the place where you built your life. Now imagine slowly starting to feel like you don't belong there anymore, like you're just a guest in your own home. That's exactly what happened to me. It didn't happen overnight. It happened so slowly that, for a long time, I kept telling myself I was just being too sensitive. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I wasn't being fair to a woman who had just lost her husband. But when I look back now, I can see every warning sign. I just didn't want to believe what was right in front of me. The first few weeks after Meredith moved in were actually okay. She mostly stayed in her room, came out for meals, watched TV in the evenings, and kept to herself. Rowan checked on her every single day. Every morning before work, he'd make her tea. After dinner, he'd sit with her for a while, and during his lunch break, he'd even call just to see how she was doing. I honestly thought it was sweet. He was taking care of his grieving mom, and I respected that. I wanted to support him. But little by little, things started to change. It started in the kitchen. One morning, I walked downstairs to make breakfast and found Meredith already there. She had rearranged everything. My mugs were in a different cabinet. The plates were stacked somewhere else. Even the little herb plants I kept on the windowsill had been moved to the counter. I stood there for a moment, looking around my own kitchen like I'd never seen it before. Meredith turned around, smiled, and said, "I hope you don't mind. I just thought this setup made more sense. Everything is easier to reach this way." I smiled back and said, "Of course, no problem." Then I went upstairs and told myself it wasn't a big deal, She had just lost her husband. Maybe she just wanted to keep herself busy. Maybe she needed to feel useful. I figured I just needed to be patient, so I didn't say anything. A little while later, it was the living room. Meredith moved the couch a little to the left. She replaced the throw pillows I'd picked with the ones she'd brought from her old house. Then she hung a large picture of herself and Leonard where my favorite painting used to be. Every time she changed something, she'd smile and say, "I just thought this looked better," or "Hope you don't mind, dear." Sometimes she'd even laugh and say, "You young people have such different taste." And every single time, Rowan stayed quiet. He'd smile, nod, or simply say, "Mom, whatever makes you comfortable." Little by little, I started feeling invisible in my own home. But what was I supposed to say? Meredith was grieving. Rowan was grieving too. I didn't want to be the difficult one. So once again, I stayed quiet. About 6 weeks after Meredith moved in, something happened that I couldn't ignore anymore. I was in my home office during an important meeting with a client. My office door was closed because I needed to focus. Meredith knocked twice, then opened the door without waiting. "Celeste," she asked, "what time is lunch today?" I held up one finger and quietly mouthed, "1 minute." She stood there for a second, made a small sound, and then closed the door. When my meeting ended, I walked downstairs and found Meredith sitting at the kitchen table with Rowan. He had come home early that day. The second I walked into the room, they both stopped talking. Rowan looked at me and said, "Mom said you ignored her earlier." I stopped where I was. "I was on a work call," I explained. "I tried to tell her I'd be with her in a minute." "She needed help," he replied. "Rowan, I was talking to a client. I couldn't just stop." He looked at me for a long moment before looking away. Then he quietly said, "Just try to be more available next time." I stood there in my own kitchen feeling like I'd done something terrible, even though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I didn't argue. I quietly walked over to the stove and started making lunch. That day, something inside me changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It just felt like a small door inside my heart had quietly closed. The house that was never mine. Part 2b, when everything started to change. After that day, things between Rowan and me slowly started to change. Before Meredith moved in, we talked every evening. We'd tell each other about our day, laugh about little things, and have those random conversations that didn't seem important at the time but somehow meant everything. Now his evenings belonged to his mom. After dinner, he'd sit with her for hours. I'd say goodnight and head upstairs while he stayed downstairs with her. Some nights, he'd come to bed so late that I was already asleep. On weekends, he'd take her to the grocery store, the park, or to visit her friends. At some point, he stopped asking me to come along. I started spending most weekends by myself, either working in my home office or sitting alone in the backyard. I kept telling myself it was just a phase. Grief changes people, and I figured he just needed more time. But weeks turned into months, and little by little, Rowan kept drifting farther away from me. About 4 months after Meredith moved in, I finally tried to talk to him. I waited until she'd gone to bed, made us both a cup of tea, and sat across from him at the kitchen table, just like we used to in the early days of our marriage. "Rowan," I said quietly, "I feel like we haven't really talked in a long time." He looked up from his phone and said, "I'm right here." I shook my head. "I know, but I mean really talked like we used to." He slowly put his phone down and sighed. "Celeste, my dad just died. My mom is still trying to adjust. I'm doing the best I can." I nodded. "I know you are. I'm not asking you to stop taking care of her. I'm just asking if we can have a little bit of us back." He stayed quiet for a few seconds before saying, "Can we do this another time? I'm tired." Then he picked up his phone, walked out of the kitchen, and left me sitting there alone with 2 cups of tea getting cold. That was the first time since Meredith moved in that I really let myself admit how lonely I'd become. I'm going to be honest with you. During those months, I started wondering if maybe the problem was me. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I wasn't patient enough. Maybe a better wife would have handled everything differently. I kept those thoughts to myself. I didn't tell my friends, and I didn't tell my parents because I didn't want them to worry. The truth is, I was embarrassed to admit that my marriage was falling apart. So I kept working, cooking, cleaning, smiling across the dinner table at Meredith every night, and pretending everything was fine, even when it clearly wasn't. The moment that changed everything happened on a completely normal Thursday afternoon. I'd finished work a little early, and since the weather was nice, I decided to spend some time in the backyard doing a little gardening. Our neighbor, Patricia, was outside working in her yard too. She was a sweet older woman, and we'd always been friendly with each other. We'd chat over the fence every now and then or wave when one of us was pulling into the driveway. She smiled when she saw me and said, "Celeste, how are you, dear? I haven't seen you outside in a while." I smiled back and said, "I've just been busy." She nodded and casually said, "It must be nice having family close by. I saw your mother-in-law talking to the delivery guy the other day. She's a very confident woman." I laughed politely and said, "Yeah, she is." Then Patricia leaned on her gardening tool and said something that stuck with me. She was telling the delivery guy which packages were hers and which ones were yours. Then she pointed and said, "This side is mine." She seems very organized. I smiled, but something inside me tightened. "Yeah," I said, "she likes things organized." We talked for another minute or two before I went back inside, but I couldn't stop thinking about those words. This side is mine. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was just a random comment to a delivery driver, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that it meant more. That evening, I went into my home office and opened my laptop. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. I just wanted to see the paperwork from when we bought the house. I searched through my emails and found the messages from the real estate agent. I found the bank records showing the $10,000 I'd transferred. I found almost everything. But I couldn't find the final title document, the one that showed who legally owned the house. I searched for almost an hour. It wasn't there. I told myself Rowan probably had a printed copy somewhere. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. But as I closed my laptop, I noticed my hands were shaking. That uneasy feeling I'd been carrying around for months wasn't quiet anymore. It was louder than ever. I didn't say anything to Rowan that night. I lay beside him in the dark and listened as he fell asleep within minutes, just like he always did. I stared at the ceiling of the bedroom in the home I'd helped pay for, the home I'd decorated, the home I'd filled with love. One question kept running through my mind over and over again. Whose name is on that document? I didn't know the answer yet. But deep down, I was already afraid of what I was about to find. The house that was never mine. Part 3A: The Truth, the Fight, and Taking It All Back. I've learned something about the truth. It doesn't always show up with a big, dramatic moment. Sometimes it comes quietly. It can be hidden inside a letter, a document, or even a single name on a piece of paper. One small detail can completely change everything you thought you knew. That's exactly how it happened to me. My truth showed up on a Friday morning. The morning after I talked to Patricia, I woke up early. Rowan had already left for work, and Meredith was still in her room. I made myself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and made a decision. I was going to find that document. I walked into Rowan's home office and opened the small filing cabinet where he kept all of our important papers. Bills, insurance records, bank statements. Everything was neatly organized. I'd never gone through those files without him before. It felt strange, almost like I was crossing a line. But at that point, I needed answers more than I needed to feel comfortable. So I went through every folder one by one: car insurance, medical records, old tax papers. Then, near the back of the bottom drawer, I found a brown envelope with the real estate company's name printed across the front. My hands were strangely calm as I opened it, even though everything inside me was shaking. I pulled out the papers and looked at the title document. I read the first line, then I read it again. Then one more time, hoping I'd somehow made a mistake. But I hadn't. My name wasn't on it. It wasn't even in Rowan's name. The house was legally owned by one person, Meredith Calloway, just her name, nobody else's. I sat there on the office floor with those papers in my hands, reading the same page over and over. Every single time, the name stayed the same. Meredith Calloway, the house I'd fallen in love with, the house I'd helped pay for with the $10,000 my parents had spent years saving. The house where Rowan and I had carried boxes through the front door, laughing together. The house where I'd built my little home office, cooked dinner every night, and tried so hard to create a happy life. None of it legally belonged to me. The truth hit me all at once. It had never been my house. I don't remember how long I stayed there. At some point, I heard Meredith's bedroom door open. I heard her footsteps down the hallway and the bathroom faucet turn on. That sound pulled me back to reality. I carefully folded the papers, slipped them back into the envelope exactly the way I'd found them, closed the drawer, and quietly walked back to my bedroom. I shut the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally let myself feel everything I'd been holding in. The shock, the betrayal, the hurt, the anger, and the deep sadness that comes from realizing the person you trusted most had been hiding something this important from you. I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I wiped my face because I knew crying wasn't going to fix anything. If I wanted answers, I had to stay calm. I had to think clearly. I had to be smart. So I took a deep breath and started making a plan. The first thing I did was call my bank. I asked them to send me a full record of the $10,000 transfer I'd made 3 years earlier. I wanted every detail in writing, including the date and the amount. They told me they could have it ready within 2 business days. As soon as I hung up, I started looking online for a family lawyer. I wasn't looking for the biggest law firm in town. I just wanted someone honest who would tell me exactly where I stood. After reading a few reviews, I found a lawyer named Sandra Reeves. I emailed her that afternoon and explained everything in simple words. I told her about the money from my parents, the house paperwork, and the title document I'd found. I asked if she had time to meet with me. Less than an hour later, she replied with a short message. "Come in Monday morning." I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in months, I didn't feel helpless. I didn't feel vanished. I felt like myself again. I still didn't tell Rowan what I'd found. Not yet. That evening I acted completely normal. We had dinner together and I asked Meredith how her day had been. I passed the food around the table like everything was fine. Rowan looked at me a couple of times with a puzzled expression, almost like he could tell something had changed but couldn't figure out what it was. I simply smiled back. On the outside, I looked calm. Inside, I was completely focused. I wasn't going to react until I knew exactly what my next move would be. The house that was never mine. Part 3B: The Truth, the Fight, and Taking It All Back. Monday morning, I walked into Sandra Reeves' office with a folder full of papers and a head full of questions. She was a calm woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a straightforward way of speaking. I liked her right away. I told her everything from the beginning. I explained how my parents had given me the $10,000, how I trusted Rowan to handle the paperwork, and how I'd recently found the title showing that the house was only in Meredith's name. She listened without interrupting and took careful notes the whole time. When I finished, she looked up and asked, "Do you have proof that you transferred the money?" I nodded and handed her the bank records. She looked through them, then asked, "And the house was bought after you got married?" "Yes," I said. She put the papers down and looked me in the eye. "Celeste, your financial contribution gives you a legal claim. In most cases, money used to buy a home during a marriage is considered marital property. Even if your name isn't on the title, these records matter." I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. "So, I actually have a case?" I asked. She gave me a small smile. "You have much more than that. You have documents, a clear timeline, and proof of your contribution." She explained my options, gave me a list of papers to collect, and walked me through every step of the process. When I left her office that morning, I felt stronger than I had in months. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. That evening after dinner, I asked Rowan if we could talk. Meredith had already gone to her room, so we sat alone at the kitchen table. It was the same table where he'd once held my hands and told me we were building a future together. I placed the bank records between us. My name, the date, the amount. Everything was printed clearly on the page. He looked down at the papers, then back at me. "I found the title document," I said quietly. The room went completely silent. "The house is in your mother's name, only her name." He didn't say a word. "I want you to explain it to me," I continued. "I'm not yelling, I'm not here to fight, I just want the truth." He stared at the papers for a long time before finally speaking. "It was her birthday," he said softly. "After Dad got sick, she was scared. She needed something that made her feel safe." I looked at him and asked, "So you gave her our house?" He quickly shook his head. "It's still our home. Nothing really changed." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Rowan, you used the money my parents spent years saving for me. You used it to buy a house in your mother's name without ever telling me." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "That wasn't a mistake," I said. That was a choice, and you kept it from me. He looked down at the table. I didn't think you'd understand. I took a slow breath before answering. You never gave me the chance to understand. You made the decision without me. Then I looked him straight in the eyes and said, I've already spoken to a lawyer. His head snapped up. Celeste, I'm not saying this to threaten you, I said calmly. I'm saying it because I know where I stand now. I know my rights, I have proof, and I have options. He just stared at me. For the first time, he realized I wasn't the same woman who'd stayed quiet for months. And he was right, I wasn't. The next few weeks weren't easy. Rowan became quiet and distant. Meredith could feel the tension in the house, so she spent more time in her room. We had several difficult conversations, but I stayed calm through all of them. I didn't yell, I didn't beg. I simply told the truth, explained what I deserved, and waited for him to meet me halfway. Sandra helped me file the paperwork to officially protect my financial contribution. It took time, but eventually we reached an agreement. The house title was updated, my name was added, and my investment was officially recognized. For the first time, the home I'd helped build finally belonged to me on paper too. Meredith and I never had a huge argument. We didn't need one. She knew what had happened. She knew I'd found the truth, and she knew I'd taken action. One evening, while I was watering my plants in the backyard, she walked over and quietly said, I want you to know, I never asked him to do it. I looked at her and simply said, I believe you. And I really did. Deep down, I never thought she'd forced Rowan to do it. I believed he'd made that decision himself because he'd spent his whole life trying to make his mother happy without thinking about what it would cost me. She nodded, turned around, and went back inside. We never talked about it again. As for Rowan and me, that's the hardest part of this story to tell. I still loved him, even after everything. But love by itself isn't enough. A relationship also needs honesty, respect, and trust. Without those things, love slowly falls apart. We started marriage counseling and spent the next 3 months having difficult conversations we'd avoided for far too long. Rowan had to face everything he'd done, not just putting the house in his mother's name, but also the months he'd spent putting me last. He had to face the nights he left me sitting alone, the cold cups of tea, and the way he'd made me feel invisible inside my own home. None of it was easy, but little by little we worked through it. We rebuilt our marriage with honesty instead of assumptions. It wasn't the same marriage we'd had before. It had scars. It was more careful, but it was real. And this time, it truly belonged to both of us. About 6 months later, Meredith decided to move into a small apartment nearby. It was her choice. I think she realized that all 3 of us living under one roof wasn't healthy anymore. Rowan still visits her often, and she's close enough that we can see her whenever we want. But now, when I walk through my front door, it finally feels like my home again. I'm sharing this story because I want you to remember something. If you help build something, your name matters, your contribution matters, your voice matters, and your place in your own home matters. You don't have to scream to be heard, and you don't have to beg for respect. Sometimes all you have to do is know your worth, keep the proof, and stand your ground. That's exactly what I did. My name is Celeste Marino. And that beautiful little house on the quiet street, with the big windows and the small backyard. It's finally mine. And it always should have been.